Hello, and welcome to this webinar in which we present the findings from our empirical research with trans and non-binary older adults and their carers. So I am Marjorie Silverman. I'm a cis woman using feminine pronouns. I am an associate professor at the University of Ottawa in the School of Social Work, specializing in critical gerontology and family care.
Hello, I'm Alexandre Baril. I am a trans man using masculine pronouns, and I'm also an associate professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Ottawa. And I'm specializing in gender, trans, queer, disability studies, as well as critical gerontology and critical suicidology.
So the empirical findings that we're presenting today have been published in 2 articles. We've also published 3 other theoretical articles on the topic of transness and dementia, and all of those references appear in this slide for the English language ones. And for the French language references, they appear in this slide. All of these articles are available for free on our academia.edu pages. So please contact us directly if you would like to receive the PDFs of those articles or the posters that summarize the empirical findings from our research project.
So we will be using numerous terms throughout this webinar, and some of which might be new to you. So we want to define all of them. So we define a carer as someone who provides regular support to a friend, acquaintance, or family member, whether biological or chosen family, without being paid. We define dementia in a broad manner as a term that encompasses all types of memory-related cognitive disabilities, such as mild cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, and Lewy body dementia. The term ableism refers to the system of oppression against disabled people. The term cogniticism is a term we coined to refer to a specific form of ableism, which represents an oppressive system that discriminates against people with cognitive or mental disabilities at multiple levels, including political, social, medical, legal, economic, and normative levels. The term that you can see on the screen, 2S-LGBTQIA+, refers to two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, and or questioning, intersex, and asexual people. And we use the expression trans and non-binary identities and trans and non-binary people to encompass a variety of gender identities and expression, including transsexual, transgender, non-binary, agender, gender non-conforming people, or anyone who does not identify with their sex and gender assigned at birth. And cisgender or cis people are those who self-identified with their sex and gender assigned at birth. And finally, the term cisgenderism is a synonym of transphobia. So cisgenderism represents a system of oppression against trans and non-binary people. And cisnormativity represents the normative dimension of cisgenderism. So it refers to the fact that cisgender people represent the norm in our society.
Canada's population, like many countries in the global north, is aging rapidly. The number of people with dementia is also rising rapidly, with 1 million Canadians expected to have dementia by 2030 and 1.7 million by 2050. In parallel to these statistics, for the first time in history, there's a growing cohort of trans and non-binary older adults whose numbers will continue to rise due to population aging, increased access to hormones and surgeries, major legal changes on trans issues, and greater social acceptance of trans and non-binary people. We're referring here to people who transitioned earlier in life and are now aging in their affirmed identity, as well as those who decided to transition in older adulthood. Many of these trans and non-binary older adults will acquire dementia and will also require care. Furthermore, there's research indicating that trans and non-binary people, along with other marginalized groups, may be more susceptible to developing dementia due to a wide variety of risk factors, including minority stress and systemic violence. There is a small amount of scholarship addressing trans and dementia, as well as 2S LGBTQIA+ and dementia more broadly. It has been found that trans and non-binary older adults have a higher risk of discrimination than their lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer counterparts, especially when it comes to long-term care. Like older adults with marginalized sexualities, trans and non-binary older adults are reticent to access formal health and social services due to real and/or anticipated fears of discrimination based on past experiences. Yet for trans and non-binary older adults, this goes one step further into the fear of bodily and intimate care, as well as the fear of misgendering. When it comes to bodily care, trans and non-binary older adults cannot go back in the closet. Their gender expression, pronouns, or bodies speak for themselves, either with scars from surgeries or with body parts that are seen as non-normative from a cisnormative perspective. In addition to deep fears of needing to rely on possibly cisgenderist and cisnormative formal services, trans and non-binary older adults often have few care choices, as well as fewer carers to whom they can turn for support. Paradoxically, this marginalized population who are among those requiring the most support in old age is instead among the most isolated.
So the research question guiding our research project was, what are the experiences of trans and non-binary older adults with dementia and their support networks? So we conducted a large Canadian-wide recruitment in both English and French, reaching out to both aging and dementia organizations as well as 2S LGBTQIA+ organizations. In total, we contacted 1,625 organizations. And despite this massive campaign, we recruited only 2 trans participants with dementia and 4 carers. But for us, these small numbers are nonetheless a victory, as they represent the first interviews at the international level with this population. And due to the pandemic context, the interviews were all conducted on Zoom. So the following table summarizes pertinent information about our 2 trans participants, Victor and Marta, and we want to specify that their names have been changed to protect their anonymity. So you can see the information about Victor and Marta on the table. So Marta, a trans woman, and Victor, a trans man, are both 75 years old. Marta was in the early stages of dementia at the time of our interview, and Victor in the later stages. Marta lives by herself and has very little support, whereas Victor lives with his wife, Nancy, who is also his carer and a carer we interviewed in our research project. So we let you look at all the information about Victor and Marta. And now the second table offers a quick snapshot of the 4 carer participants. And what's interesting, as you can see on the screen, is that 3 of the 4 participants identify as trans or non-binary themselves, and also as queer. And some of the carers interviewed are providing care only for 1 person with dementia, while others care or have cared for up to 3 people, as it is the case with Dan. You can see it in the last row, last column, where Dan is caring for 3 people. In total, they care for 5 different trans or non-binary people living with dementia. And again, we will let you look at all the information in this table. So we will now present the unique aspects of living with dementia as a trans or non-binary person, or of caring for a trans or non-binary person living with dementia. While the trans and non-binary people living with dementia share common experiences with both cisgender people living with dementia and trans and non-binary people of all age with or without cognitive disabilities, The fact of living at the intersection of transness or non-binariness and dementia comes with specific realities, which we will highlight. And the same is true regarding carers. While the carers we interviewed share many common realities with other carers, those who care for trans or non-binary people with dementia experience unique realities. So we will first present the unique aspects regarding trans and non-binary people themselves. Then we will present the unique aspects for the carers. And it's important to note that regarding the findings about trans and non-binary participants, we are discussing results based on both the interviews we did with the 2 trans participants, as well as the carers for various trans and non-binary people living with dementia.
While people living with dementia are often invalidated and discredited as knowledgeable subjects from a cogniticist lens, for trans and non-binary people with dementia, the cogniticism manifests in specific ways. Participants told us that their self-identified gender is taken less seriously due to the cogniticism prevalent among healthcare providers. There are very concrete impacts of this delegitimization, such as exacerbated forms of gatekeeping regarding gender-affirming healthcare. Both Martha and Victor recounted examples of being blocked access to gender-confirming surgeries by doctors who believed, based on ageist, ableist, and cogniticist perceptions, that those kinds of surgeries are less of a priority in later life and are riskier at an older age or when the person lives with physical and/or cognitive health issues. Martha stated, the problem was when I was looking into it with doctors, they said, oh, you're over 65. We're not going to touch you, not going to do surgery. You're too old, too much of a risk, whatever, all kinds of excuses. A similar gatekeeping occurred for some people in regard to hormone treatments. Dan recounted that one of the trans men he is caring for experienced difficulty accessing the hormone treatment that he's been undergoing for over a decade. Dan confirmed that this decision was based on the cogniticist presumption that people living with dementia cannot provide informed consent. Doctors haven't wanted to prescribe hormones because at this point, they don't think informed consent can be a thing. So, sure, let's just take him off. They're not even validating who he is. They're going to take away his hormones because they don't think he's capable of making a decision. The ageism and cogniticism that fuel the cisgenderist gatekeeping among healthcare professionals deeply impacts people's gender identity. If hormone treatments are discontinued or if surgeries are denied, it transforms the way gender is experienced. Furthermore, not having access to some medical treatments and surgeries places trans people at a greater risk of experiencing cisgenderist violence, since their gender expression might change or their bodily features may no longer match their gender identity. Now we will explore how dementia impacts the experience of cisgenderism and gender identity. Dementia has the potential to increase exposure to cisgenderist violence. For example, increased care needs due to dementia could require someone to move to a long-term care home where they might become victim of mistreatment. Victor, during the 7 months in which he was living in a long-term care facility, found that his transness was the epicenter of cisgenderist curiosity and mistreatment. His wife, Nancy, finally brought him back home as he was suffering too much mistreatment. Additionally, many trans older adults, such as Victor, who lived stealth for decades, meaning not being out as a trans person, are outed due to their need for bodily care. Many find it quite violent to be outed in this way and want to continue to live stealth, as Dan mentioned regarding the trans people he is caring for. They wanted to live quiet lives where they could just be who they were and try to, blend and have a simple life. Participants also explained that dementia impacts the possibility for trans and non-binary people to advocate for themselves and to defend themselves against cisgenderist microaggressions and violence. When people living with dementia, it becomes more difficult for trans and non-binary people to fight gatekeeping, to navigate the complicated healthcare system or to defend themselves against instances of misgendering. In the case of Victor, it was very difficult for him to stop the recurrent misgendering and mistreatment by some of the employees in the long-term care home. For example, Victor said, that was really difficult, a real challenge. And I got scared because I thought, wow, I am trapped in something here. Will it last forever? While dementia can also impact gender expression through the increased difficulty of performing the bodily care necessary to maintain one's gender expression, none of the trans participants we interviewed, nor those who are cared for by the carers we interviewed, felt that dementia transformed their relationship to their gender identity. All of them have a deep sense of their gender identity, and none had forgotten their chosen identity.
So now we will discuss how cisgenderism and gender identity impact the experience of cognitivism and dementia. So the isolation, loneliness, and lack of support network that many trans and non-binary people experience due in large part to cisgenderism or transphobia can increase the cognitivism they face. While ageist and cogniticist microaggressions, abuses, mistreatments, and violence committed toward people living with dementia in various settings are common and documented, those treatments are often denounced by the support network. So having a strong support network diminishes the chances of experiencing those forms of violence or the duration or the intensity of them. So knowing that a lot of trans people don't benefit from a strong support network, they might be left to fend for themselves and might not have anyone to notice, denounce, and support them to escape from abusive situations. In that sense, the isolation resulting from cisgenderism can amplify ageist and cogniticist violence. In addition to having fewer carers to support them, the cisgenderism experienced by trans and non-binary people living with dementia also limits their care options. Not only does it reduce the chance of finding culturally competent residences, but it also reduces options for home care. For example, Victor and Nancy explained that misgendering episodes still occur with some providers that come to their home. Marta also told us about the cisgenderist attitudes of many healthcare providers. She said, and I quote, "I had one incident at that hospital because of my documentation at that time, it still said male, and the doctor refused to call me Marta. She wanted to use my dead name, my birth name." Cisgenderism can also impact dementia directly. So not only does the minority stress experienced by trans and non-binary people throughout their lives increase their chance of having dementia, but the symptoms of dementia themselves can worsen due to the structural violence and hurdle they experience on a daily level in our society. So this was the case for Victor, who, due to severe forms of cisgenderist violence he experienced during his stay in the long-term care home, saw an increase of his dementia symptoms, such as anxiety and hallucinations. Both Dan and Jesse, who care for David, mentioned that the delegitimization of David's identity by some healthcare professionals, the gatekeeping he experienced in regard to potential surgery, and the gender dysphoria he is going through because of that propel him into negative and self-destructive loops during which he hits his head, which in turn create more head injuries and dementia symptoms. And because it's important to mention that David's dementia comes from repetitive head injuries associated with his neurodivergence.
We're going to speak now about the silo mentality among practitioners that erases intersecting identities and oppressions. Health and social service practitioners rarely consider the identities, realities, and health issues of trans and non-binary people living with dementia from an intersectional lens. Providers tend to adhere to a silo mentality, in which each aspect of identity, whether transness, dementia, old age, or any other identity components, are each treated as if they were separate and not connected to structural oppressions. Dan explained that for the 2 trans men for whom he cares, practitioners tend to interpret everything either through the lens of transness or through the lens of dementia. Lou expressed a similar experience regarding the way their non-binary parent is treated. Their non-binariness is completely dismissed by healthcare providers who focus only on physical and cognitive health issues. So Lou says they don't care about their gender identity. They just want to talk about what the issue is. So if it's about like x-rays for my parents' back, then it's x-rays. Just focus on the x-rays. While this erasure and invisibility of transness and cisgenderism on the part of healthcare providers is predominant, there are other instances where reversely transness becomes scrutinized and highly hyper-visible. For example, Nancy explained that a few times when Victor consulted dementia specialists, much of the appointment time got taken up with questions about Victor's gender identity rather than his current health needs. Intrusive questions were asked about his identity and body, fueling an objectification and mystification, as we often observe regarding trans people, their bodies, and their transitions. These experiences show how the lack of an intersectional perspective represents missed opportunities to develop an integrated care plan that takes the multiple aspects of people's identity into consideration. We now turn to the findings related to the carers we interviewed. We identified 3 main themes that encapsulate the unique aspects of caring for a trans or non-binary person with dementia. The first pertains to how and why the participants entered their caregiving role. Unlike Lou, who's caring for a parent, or Nancy, who's caring for a partner, which are 2 common care configurations, Jessie and Dan arrived at their caregiving roles through non-normative pathways. Jessie, who is caring for a long-distance chosen family member, and Dan, who is caring for multiple community members, have in part found themselves in caregiving roles because of their own non-binariness or transness. For example, Dan discussed how he came to be a carer for his neighbor, Ben. In the case of my neighbor, it was very much, you are the only other trans person we know. You are the token trans person. Similarly, Jessie explained that their own transness is very much front and center in the role they play in caring for David, and that their own gender identity makes them in some ways qualified for this role. This perspective is evident in the following statement, in which Jessie talks about advocating for David to receive his gender-affirming surgery. I can provide an advocacy because of my experiences, because I lived in a small town and, I've had to fight tooth and nail for everything in every bit of my care across the board. Dan and Jessie's narratives can propel us toward new analyses of care, namely rethinking the pathways into care when it comes to marginalized communities. Although chosen family and community links are important in the stories of Dan and Jessie, they alone do not paint the entire portrait of how Dan and Jessie became carers. We believe that their stories of care invite us to think about care through an intersectional lens that brings to the foreground the theme of oppression. It invites us to reflect about what oppressions the carers have experienced and how these experiences influence their role. Furthermore, it also invites us to think about how to ensure that the caregiving role will not further marginalize these carers.
So the second theme we identified is related to care tasks. The 4 carers in the study explained that they carry out tasks that are specifically related to gender identity or expression, including the following 3 tasks. So sustaining the gendered self, providing gendered body care, and advocating for the trans or non-binary person with dementia. So when it comes to gender expression, Lou explained that they help their parent buy clothes and cut their parents' hair the way they like it. Similarly, Jesse explained that they assisted David in modifying certain gendered practices, such as shaving, so he can continue to perform them autonomously. Yet there are some tasks that David is no longer able to perform without assistance, such as chest binding, and this causes him distress. Jesse explains, right now he's choosing not to bind because that's too difficult to do. And if I'm not there, and if he's not up for something, when his sister is not around, then there's no one there to help him with that. So while carers for cisgender people with dementia may still have to offer support around tasks like shaving and dressing, in the case of trans or non-binary people with dementia, these aspects often contain unique importance as they are a key part of how trans and non-binary people express their identity to the outside world. In addition to helping the trans and non-binary people with dementia maintain their gendered appearance, the participants also engage in gendered-related body care. So for most participants, this involves helping with hormones. In Nancy's case, she also has to accompany her husband to the toilet every time he needs to urinate. Due to what Nancy and Victor characterize as an unsuccessful bottom surgery conducted in the 1970s, Victor never obtained the penis he wished for. However, in his state of advanced dementia, Victor believes that he has a functional penis, allowing him to urinate while standing up, which is not the case. So Nancy described how she must explain to him each time that he cannot urinate while standing up. If we let him to do it when he goes to the toilet, no matter how hard we try, he faces the toilet, he acts as if he has a penis, and if we don't intervene, he'll pee on the floor. He doesn't want to understand that he doesn't have one. So while carers for cisgender people with dementia often have to help with various forms of bodily care, in the case of carers for trans and non-binary people with dementia, these tasks are often deeply intertwined with gender, and this necessitates additional sensitivity, awareness, and support.
The carers also spoke about the large role they play regarding gender-related advocacy, including the day-to-day emotional labor of helping the trans or non-binary person feel safe and comfortable. For example, Lou explained that they must accompany their parent to medical appointments because if they're not present, their parent is taken less seriously regarding their non-binary identity. For example, Jesse also explained that David needs to accompany, also explained that David needs accompaniment to appointments in part to advocate on his behalf when it comes to topics such as gender affirming surgery. The carer's advocacy role also involves protecting the emotional well-being of the person with dementia. For example, Dan expressed the following sentiment when speaking about David: "We're not going to let other people invalidate him." The emotional labor involved in advocacy is something that is often not emphasized when it comes to care. And the participants' stories provide excellent examples of the ways in which care tasks can be linked to oppression. For example, advocating on behalf of the trans or non-binary person with dementia is necessary due to the discrimination and oppression the person is facing. Similarly, helping the trans or non-binary person maintain a consistent gendered appearance also protects them from further stigma, since trans and non-binary older adults who have an inconsistent gender expression are often perceived as confused, and even more so when they have dementia. As much as the carers are trying to protect the people for whom they are caring from further oppression, The reality is that both the trans and non-binary people with dementia and their carers face multiple forms of discrimination, as well as anxiety about future discrimination. Martha shared with us some of her anxieties about her future, in particular, having no one to rely on to implement advanced directives. Martha says, what's the point of writing it down if there's no one out there I actually trust, right? The carers pointed to numerous forms of discrimination directed towards the trans and non-binary person with dementia. As we mentioned earlier, this included examples such as excessive forms of gatekeeping, misgendering, or not being taken seriously by practitioners. After asking Martha if she feels that being trans and older and living with dementia led people to take her less seriously and invalidate her opinions, she said, yeah, and at a higher risk of, I think the word is mistreated. Some carers explained that they had to intervene in similar instances, indicating how their roles are mediated by the direct and indirect cisgenderist violence experienced by the person they're caring for. In addition to witnessing and managing the discrimination directed at the trans or non-binary person with dementia, the carers themselves also faced direct forms of discrimination. So Nancy, for example, recounted how people assume she's a lesbian while she identifies as heterosexual, simply because she is married to a trans man. For the 3 participants who identified as trans or non-binary, caregiving became one more sphere of life in which they had to face cisgenderist discrimination. Lou discussed how medical professionals systematically misgender both them and their parent. Some participants mentioned that their own traumas can be triggered by witnessing the cisgenderist discrimination faced by the person for whom they are caring. These experiences of violence and discrimination unfortunately confirm many trans and non-binary people's worst fears when it comes to being dependent on others for care, especially intimate care. As a result, the options for care are more limited at the institutional level as well as at home. Jessie explained the difficulty of finding people to help at home. If somebody comes in, especially to the home where there's multiple vulnerable people, there's not just him that's trans in that household, and somebody doesn't really have the compassion or doesn't have the knowledge, that's going to impact more than just him. And he's also really vulnerable about his body. So he doesn't necessarily want people he doesn't know touching him, especially if he's not going to remember who somebody is. So if long-term care is not seen as a viable option to most trans and non-binary people due to discrimination, and if it's also difficult to find trustworthy people to assist at home, this leads to a heavy responsibility on the shoulders of a few select carers.
So we would like to end this webinar with recommendations for practitioners. The participants in our research were very clear about the fact that numerous changes are needed in the health and social service system to better meet the needs of trans and non-binary people with dementia and their carers. The following is a summary of their recommendations. So first, participants told us about the need to produce more research on the topic and that this research should also embrace an intersectional lens and avoid a silo mentality. Second, participants mentioned the importance of recognizing the experiential knowledge that trans and non-binary people living with dementia have, but that is often delegitimized and disregarded. Some carers suggested including trans and non-binary people living with dementia and their carers in working groups and advisory boards for various institutions where decisions are made about them, but often without them, unfortunately. Victor, for example, said, and I quote, "I'm sure that many people living with dementia understand much more than what we think. I'm sure because I'm not that exceptional. You must not go overboard because if I understand as much as I can at the moment, I believe there must be others like me." Third, All participants mentioned the vital need to sensitize, educate, and train health and social service practitioners. Marta, who is involved in community organizations to provide such education, told us that the trainings in which she was involved were sometimes unfortunately met with resistance. That speaks to the importance of not only providing effective education and ongoing training, but working simultaneously on people's hearts and minds in order to sensitize them about the importance of becoming culturally competent on the topic. Fourth, participants mentioned the necessity to adapt the current services in diverse institutions and organizations dedicated either to trans and non-binary people or to people living with dementia. Indeed, while the former often focus on youth or trans adults, sometimes forgetting or erasing the needs of trans and non-binary older people, the latter often believe that they don't have trans or non-binary people among their older adult clientele. This was something, in fact, that we were told frequently by organizations when we were recruiting for this project. Participants discussed the importance, therefore, for those services to stop making assumptions about gender identity or expression, or about cognitive ability and disability, and to be accessible to people with disabilities, and to be trauma-informed, taking into consideration the different traumas trans and non-binary people have experienced in their life course.
Fifth, in addition to adapting current services to be more inclusive of trans and non-binary people, participants state that it is crucial to create dedicated resources and services for trans and non-binary people living with dementia, such as more 2S LGBTQIA+ long-term care homes. Sixth, participants mentioned the importance of ensuring that research, knowledge, best practices, tools, and adapted services reach rural areas. Victor and Nancy, who initially lived in a rural area, had to move twice to get closer to the specialized care Victor needed. Forcing people to move to large urban centers to obtain proper services cuts them off from key community links. Carers living in rural areas also told us about the importance of disseminating knowledge and tools outside of urban centers. Last, but certainly not least, all the participants insisted on the importance of adopting a non-judgmental attitude and respect. Victor told us the following recommendation: to talk to the person, that's for sure, and to respect them. Yes, 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 yes. Martha told us that respect is at the core of everything. She distinguished between acceptance and respect and insisted that respect doesn't necessarily mean agreeing with other people's identities and choices. Martha says, I tell people I don't want to be tolerated, I don't expect to be accepted, but I demand respect. These recommendations echo the ones available in the existing literature on transness and dementia. If you're interested in accessing concrete educational tools and guidelines in English and French on the topic of 2S LGBTQIA+ older adults and/or dementia, we invite you to visit the websites of Égal Canada and the Fondation Émergence. Thank you so much for your interest in our research. We hope this webinar was informative and helpful. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us to receive any of our publications on the topic or the posters that summarize these findings. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.